Truth.
Welcome to Reach for the Truth TV. I'm your host, Welsh Will. What are we to make of the mainstream media's current lack of popularity? Over the past 10 years, and especially so since the election of Donald Trump, corporate media has lost a lot of credibility with ordinary folk. I think this beleaguered industry can only blame itself for the trouble it's in. A recent Gallup poll states, and I quote, "Americans' trust and confidence in the mass media to report the news fully, accurately and fairly has dropped to its lowest level in Gallup polling history, with just 32% saying they have a great deal or fair amount of trust in the media," unquote. Americans' trust in the media has fallen slowly and steadily over time, and it has been below a majority level since 2007. So why has the trust of many Americans in the media been eroding over the last few years? I think the answer is simple. People are beginning to see through the propaganda, especially young people. The internet has some very good resources which give a broader view of the world and politics. With this access to other viewpoints, media trust has evaporated. More and more people are discerning that we are no longer given the news impartially. Instead, we are bombarded with pundits or so-called experts, those who think they impart deep knowledge to us more ignorant folk. It is true the media has had immense power within the great democracies, because just about all of their citizens got their news from the media. That is changing with the advent of the internet. However, media coverage still shapes how people perceive the world and what they consider to be important to some extent still. We are shown the world through a keyhole by mainstream media via the lens of narrative. Most people are moving beyond seeing corporate media as a transparent representation of the world. Rather, it is seen as a storytelling machine. Since the election of Donald Trump, corporate media has been forever exposed. It will never be able to crawl back under the rock it has operated from for so long, pretending to be truth and reality, feigning to be the oracle of all that's true, when it turns out to be a lie. It's the CIA, it's Intel, it's globalism, it's corporatism. The mainstream media should no longer be looked upon as a true representation of the world and global events. Alternative media is growing in popularity. It isn't perfect by any means. It has been penetrated with a lot of phonies working for other interests apart from ours in the alternative arena. But on the whole, it's a lot better. And we continually hope people will continue to come over to us, the alternative, because then they at least have a fighting chance at reality. If you ask a journalist about the main ingredient of their job, they will tell you the story. It's all about the story. And a lot of the time it's the story with a spin. But there is a difference between the story and narrative. A story is a sequence of events known as the plot. Narrative is the way those events are put together to be presented to the audience. So when we talk of narrative, we are talking of the way we analyze the construction of the story. That is, the way it has been put together, not the story itself. So we have to understand how the world is mediated to us via these large corporate media outlets. Now, the manipulation is more often subtle. They put a show of impartiality. But sometimes the manipulation is in your face, bold and unpretentious. The screen drops for a while and the puppet masters are in full view. They dominate our world without us realizing sometimes. And they offer us reality in the form of hyperbole and parody. We could view this as a form of representation. Who or what is represented is dependent often on the owners of the media corporations. And we have to remember, the media's primary concern is economic. This is in opposition to what the media is supposed to be. The media should be the sword of democracy. It should act as the watchdog to protect public interest against malpractice and create public awareness. The media is, or should be, the fourth pillar of democracy, along with the judiciary, executive, and legislative. It is known as the fourth estate. So when the media is distrusted, the foundation of our democracy is affected. Now, I understand this is a utopian view of the media, because the media is not a single entity. Rather, it's a vast information machine consisting of a diverse system of opposing organizations, which themselves are a group of motley people, most of which are flawed media merchants, with individual strengths, weaknesses, biases, and blind spots. But that doesn't mean the media should strive for an independent stand, because an independent media is vital to democracy. Accountability is part of that power that people should expect from the influences of an impartial media. The media should be acting as an effective check on government power and influence over its citizens. But the sad fact is, the media, owned by large corporations, has become the mouthpiece of the establishment. In this way, the media now lacks the principles of objective and impartial reporting, and instead seems to be taking one side or another of the political spectrum, and at best provides relatively biased coverage, or at worst act as virtual propaganda machines. The latter, I fear, is the predominant situation today. The emergence of media empires has had a deleterious effect on society. A few individuals have managed to concentrate vast amounts of media assets and use them to actively influence political opinion. So it follows that these individuals can, from whichever point of the political spectrum, deliver a powerful political message on behalf or against a political establishment through their respective empires. This can be especially damaging if parts of the general public are more exposed to one particular media empire, either due to its popularity or the lack of alternative media sources. The result of all this is that the quality of information we receive has become distorted, which in turn distorts decisions we make based on the information. An upside, if you can call it that, is that cable news is in trouble. The Pew Research Center reports that the median daily audience for Fox, CNN, and MSNBC is down about 11% since 2008. Many are seeing a grim future for the industry. The argument is that cable news is pretty much where newspapers were a decade ago. Their audience is aging. Their medium is being disrupted by new technologies. And the next generation of viewers is developing habits and preferences that they're poorly placed to serve. It has been interesting to watch some of the elites, celebrities, and members of the corrupt media have embarrassing, infantile meltdowns and childlike tantrums over Donald Trump's election victory. For me, it has been somewhat amusing to see how these celebs are totally out of touch with reality. But what is disturbing about this, as amusing as it was to watch, is that so many members of the media who have, remember, a duty to report impartially what the majority of Americans are thinking and feeling, are genuinely shocked by the election results. Because there is no reason why a journalist with a functioning brain should be the slightest bit shocked by Trump's victory, if they were actually doing their job. They allowed their arrogance and extreme narcissism to completely blind them from the revolution that was going on right under their smug noses. The media refused to listen to what the people had to say. They chose instead to listen to themselves or the selective opinions of those they agreed with. The so-called elite media not only have a gross sense of self-righteousness, some of them are blatant and pathological liars. Mainstream media is becoming unraveled. Their demise has been many years in the making, and what we saw during this past election has been stunning. Their doom is writ large because we have seen that they cannot be trusted. We have seen them collude with certain political parties at the expense of others. And instead of being an impartial observer like it's supposed to be, the media turned into an active participant in all sorts of developments by lobbying hard on behalf of the establishment, which has resulted in it dramatically falling out of favor with the people.
The Clinton campaign believed until 9 o'clock that they had a lock on this, that they were going to win. The fault of that actually lies with the media. And there's some self-reflection. Jim Rutenberg today writes a fascinating article where the New York Times editor and others basically come to terms with the fact that they stopped being journalists over the past month and began being cheerleaders and began being people who had a conclusion that they reached and then searched for facts to show that Hillary Clinton was a 92, 93, 99.999% chance winner of winning this campaign.
Well, how else would you explain it except that they were searching for those facts? I'm wondering, I mean, was it a big aberration or?
No, it wasn't a big aberration. It was there the entire time. They didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to see it. And I will just say it. When people like Mark, us, Nate Silver, even, and I want you guys to think about this, at the Times and the Washington Post, people I know and love, I want you to think about this, that when anybody even made the suggestion that Donald Trump could be elected president of the United States, it was their journalistic standards that were questioned. When Mark Halperin suggested that there was a pathway forward for Donald Trump as president of the United States, I won't name names because so many of them are my friends, and there's no need to name names now. The time for recrimination is over. But reporters at some of the best newspapers in the world, anchors at some of the best news networks in the world, mocked and ridiculed Mark Halperin. I want you to think about this. They mocked and ridiculed him not for saying that Donald Trump is going to be elected president of the United States. They mocked and ridiculed him for saying there was a slight chance that Donald Trump could be elected president of the United States. Now, if your job, you thought, and Jim Rutenberg did say back in August, the New York Times job and journalist's job now was to defeat Donald Trump. That was the editor of the New York Times confirmed that. If you really think that's your job, think about this. Think about what you did. You were trying to help Hillary Clinton defeat Donald Trump because you thought Donald Trump would be such a malignant cancer on our constitutional republic. But you did two things. The first thing you did is you put liberals and Democrats and independents who thought like you put them in a position where they were complacent, where they really did believe, not only in New York, but across America and the world, that Hillary Clinton had a 98.999% chance of being elected president of the United States. So if that's the case, why do I have to go to the phone banks? Why do I have to knock on doors? Why do I have to go out of my house at 7 o'clock at night and get in my car and drive 2 blocks over and talk to a friend who's wavering and sit down and explain to them why Hillary Clinton would be best for the... I don't need to do that.
Why do I have to vote?
You've told me. she's got a 98.99% chance of winning, or a 90% chance of winning if we're talking about the upshot. Poor Nate Silver got slammed for saying she had a 70% chance of winning. You understand that? That's the first thing you did. The second thing you did, which I think you're beginning to understand now from reading Jim Rutenberg's really good penetrating article, is you completely ignored the world, the elite cluster that you don't know. You had a complete blind spot, and you wanted to keep it that way. It was much easier for you to stay in Manhattan and say, you know what, they're only voting for Trump because they're racist and bigots. There's no way he can win because they're all just racist and bigots. Well, if you really do believe that, then you believe that 50 million people in America are racist and bigots. And if you really do believe that, then I take pity on you. You still don't understand what Michael Moore, yes? What Michael Moore understands. America is hurting. Economically, middle America is hurting. Read J.D. Vance's book. If you don't understand what's going on out there, you don't understand what's going on. And let's face it, I don't understand what's going on out there. But you know what Mark and I did that you didn't do? You know what Mika did that you didn't do? We actually talked to people in middle America. And they told us they were hurting, and they told us why they were voting for Trump. Mark, my God, Mark, you were with Donald Trump's campaign for the last, 72, 96 hours? And you saw crowds in Michigan and these other states, Wisconsin, Minnesota, crowds that you've never seen before.
Yeah, Sunday on a Circus, we're going to have the tour. Mark McKinnon and I covered Donald Trump for the last 3 days and talked to a lot of voters. And I think you hear those voices, as we heard all year when we traveled and actually talked to people supporting Trump. You said a lot of things I want to respond to. I just want to say one thing. I love the New York Times. I think it's a great institution.
By the way, I need to say this point of personal privilege. I love the New York Times. And I read it every day. I've said this time and time again. I have the greatest respect for the reporters over there. I don't know what I'd do. And I know a lot of conservatives are going to, I don't know what I would do without the New York Times. It's how I gauge.
It's not just the New York Times.
I agree, but
I love the Washington Post.
No, but look at the headline. Look at the headline of this story.
Look at the headline.
Look at the headline of this story. This is the day after.
Look at it.
A surprising underdog sweeping victory. And their headline is not disaffected Americans have a champion going to the White House or the country votes for fundamental change. The headline's about how disappointed the friends of the people who run the New York Times are about what's happened. I mean, it's amazing.
Democrats, students,
it's amazing to me that this is the headline of the New York Times.
Face the reality of
and I'm not picking on the Times, but it's a great example.
Look at this. Look at this.
Right.
This is staggering. It really is, Mark.
I mean,
it's
the onion.
This shows that the editors of the New York Times, who I have the greatest respect for them, they don't get it. This is actually
about them.
A Saturday Night Live skit. You went to a cocktail party the night before, and you decided to write this.
What else is still to come, indeed? DNC interim chair Donna Brazile is in hot water and in the hot seat after being outed through WikiLeaks to be sliding debate questions to the Clinton team in advance. It cost her a commentator position at CNN, and executives there have called her actions disgusting. But is this all show? Would they really care if it hadn't been leaked, but instead, if they'd found out for themselves, maybe just kept it quiet? What does this say about media swaying elections? Let's bring in legal and media analyst Lionel of Lionel Media. Sir, welcome. Do you think that the media, even being caught out like this, employing operatives, would ever admit to bias?
No, of course not, because they are biased. And it killed CNN to have to excuse, dismiss, expurgate, boodlerize, remove Donna Brazile. I mean, Donna Brazile, I would have loved for her to say, really? I'm biased? Let me get this straight. I'm too biased for CNN? Okay, I'll play that game. Look, here's how the media can do it. And I love these articles that we reviewed today for our disquisition today. Because the media will always say, well, of course, we're not biased. And after all, even if we were biased, is there any evidence that our bias affects anything? Well, let's assume Lindsey France is running for office. How could I, the mainstream media, show bias against you or for you. Number one, not covering you. That would be good. How do people know I've left stories out? Who pours through the newspapers and watches TV and says, hey, I noticed there wasn't a Lindsey France story today. I think they're leaving it out. No, the absence of something does not give any indication that it's missing.
Yeah.
Number two, I can create the illusion of consensus. Well, Lindsey France is down 58% in the polls. The Zogby, the Raspy, poll. She's down with women, down with veterans, down with this. That's news. But I can also create the illusion of either negative or pro. And the most important thing today, speaking of CNN in particular, there used to be a time when we had a firewall between news and commentary. I mean, they made such a big deal. This is a commentary now. I'm giving when Walter Cronkite made his famous Vietnam statement, when Lyndon Johnson said, when you've lost Cronkite, you've lost Middle America, there was absolutely no doubt this was commentary. Today, Lindsey, you watch, there is no news, it's all commentary. That's the funny part. It's all commentary. Watch anything, especially in the morning. So, what's going to happen right now? After all this is done, and the election is over, and we say, okay, media, now that you've enjoyed these incredible ratings, thanks in great part to Donald Trump and this thing called the Trump election, because let's face it, he's created a momentum in and of himself that nobody else has, and throw in now WikiLeaks, Weiner, Huma, Comey, Podesta emails. I mean, this is unbelievable. Now, when all this is over with, then let's see how the media regroup, the news media, the mainstream media. Let's see what we say to them. Will the public say, okay, CNN and MSDNC and ABC and whatever it is, thanks a lot for this great coverage. But just to let you know, we enjoyed the circus. We just don't believe you anymore.
Well,
and watch for alternative platforms.
Like us. What did you think? You know, John Klein came out, former head of CNN, and he said, when media started employing operatives, and not just, quote, analysts, but operatives in campaigns, and people who have, even people who have no real credibility, they've run failing campaigns, they were failed public servants. I mean, Elliot Spitzer got his own show, for God's sake. He said that was a real turning point. Now, his tenure at CNN ended about 2010, and the talking head stuff has just ratcheted up. Do you see a change after this? Do you think media companies are going to worry about their reputation more, or is it just whatever? No, that's a no.
No!
Okay,
reputation. Look, no, it's a great question. Let me tell you something. As you know, right now, the mainstream news media, it's a runaway train, and we've got to keep feeding this. Now, listen, sometimes there are people who used to be in, let's say, operatives, Karl Roves and others who used to be senators and Axelrods. Okay, they're operatives. But when you have, like Lewandowski and Donna Brazile going back and forth, operatives, almost like double agents, that's one thing. But I don't think anybody watching that even cares. The bottom line is simply this. Their profits are plummeting. Newsrooms are being shuttered right now. Look at what's happening today. Look at the New York Times. By the way, another foreign-owned, Carlos Slim media, profits down 96% this quarter. Look at Washington Post with Bezos. These aren't even investigative journalistic platforms anymore.
No, they're not.
These are like almost playthings of the uber rich.
Yeah.
Let me tell you something. What you and I are doing right now, the very fact that you can give me or anybody else and the guests before and after me an amount of time to discuss this, where you're not, unlike CNN, yelling, cut his mic, cut his mic. This is the part, and more importantly, this is the same. How many times have we read that Donald Trump and Russia are married, and then they had to reluctantly say, okay, we were wrong.
Yeah.
Well, where's the retraction?
One of the most revealing aspects of this has been the exposure of journalism. The exposure of journalism as an extension of that same corrupt, established power that I've been speaking about. They're not independent, they are echo chambers. They amplify and echo that which is handed down to them. Look, and the worst, of course, the greatest echoes are the so-called enlightened, respectable, liberal press. The New York Times has become a kind of Cold War propaganda sheet with all the nonsense about Russia interfering in this campaign. The Guardian has given up. Yesterday, we had in The Guardian an article called The Hall of Shame by Jonathan Friedland, in which he pointed the finger at a truth teller like Julian Assange, as if he would be to blame if Hillary Clinton, this paragon of liberal virtue, was defeated. It was grotesque. That's not journalism. And whether journalists now stand back, they can believe, they can sulk and wring their hands and say, we have somebody now is a monster. Not at all. There was a monstrous situation applied in the United States, and journalists enabled it. In a sense, they created Trump.
The liberals, the pro-Hillary people.
Yes, the media, because the media, along with the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, and all the rest, including the Republican Party, were Trump's opponents. But they were the shouters. They were the shouters. The BBC, CNN, as I mentioned, The Guardian, New York Times, and, you name it, they were all there because Hillary Clinton represented them.
Orwell's nightmare, a place where propaganda rules, where thought is controlled.
Comrades, attention! Here is a special bulletin from the Ministry of Peace.
It's now a familiar, if chilling, Cold War fable. Most of us would say it's old hat. But is it?
The thought police are joining you.
The chief job of a newspaper is to inform, to tell people...
For decades, the freedoms of thought and expression have been central to Western democracy. The media sees itself as free, fearless, stroppy. And for many in power, the press are too strong. So the idea that Orwell's warning is still relevant may seem bizarre. But not to Noam Chomsky, who thinks the image of a truth-seeking media is a sham. Chomsky has devoted his life to questioning Western state power. Having virtually invented modern linguistics by the age of 30, Chomsky joined the gathering swell of protest in the 60s.
I'm Noam Chomsky. I'm on the faculty at MIT, and I've been getting more and more heavily involved in anti-war activities for the last few years.
Since then, Chomsky has championed a brand of anarchism, becoming deeply hostile to established power and privilege. And in recent years, he's refined what he calls the propaganda model of the media.
Well, on a brighter note,
commercial break.
The government has now...
He claims that the mass media brainwash under freedom. Not only do the media systematically suppress and distort, when they do present facts, the context obscures their real meaning.
Stop about every 1,000 miles ain't asking too much, is it? You might wish to stay on and listen.
The invasion of East Timor by the Indonesian army caused indescribable slaughter. Hundreds of thousands died. But it was more or less ignored by the mainstream Western media because, Chomsky argues, we were selling arms to the aggressors. But wars where the West's interests are directly involved get a different treatment. For Chomsky, coverage of the Gulf War was servile, trivial criticisms were aired, fundamental ones were ignored.
Well, hello. Andrew Marr. Very nice to see you. Hi.
Naturally, Chomsky has numerous critics.
Which chair has been allotted?
Is the media so influential?
I'm over here. Okay.
Have dissident views really been excluded in an age of relative media diversity, in the age of the internet?
Right. This is one of...
What about Chomsky's own access?
Okay.
What about this very programme?
Okay, Andrew, in your own time. Professor Chomsky, could we start by listening to explain what the propaganda model, as you call it, is? For many people, the idea that propaganda is used by democratic rather than merely authoritarian governments will be a strange one.
Well, the term propaganda fell into disfavor at around the Second World War, but in the 1920s and the 1930s, it was commonly used and, in fact, advocated not by leading intellectuals, by the founders of modern political science, by Wilsonian progressives, and, of course, by the public relations industry, as a necessary technique to overcome the danger of democracy. The institutional structure of the media is quite straightforward. We're talking about the United States, but it's not very different elsewhere. The major, there are sectors, but the agenda-setting media, the ones that sort of set the framework for everyone else, like the New York Times and the Washington Post and so on, these are major corporations, parts of even bigger conglomerates. Like other corporate institutions, they have a product and a market. Their market is advertisers, that is, other businesses. Their product is relatively privileged audiences, more or less.
So they're selling audiences to
They're
other
selling
corporations.
privileged audience. These are big corporations selling privileged audiences to other corporations. Now the question is, what picture of the world would a rational person expect to come out of this structure? Then we draw some conclusions about what you'd expect, and then we check, and yes, that's the picture of the world that comes out.
And is this anything more than the idea that basically the press is relatively right-wing, with some exceptions, because it's owned by big business, which is a truism, is well known?
Well, I would call the press relatively liberal. Here I agree with the right-wing critics. So especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, which are called, without a trace of irony, the New York Times is called the establishment left in, say, major foreign policy journals. And that's correct, but what's not recognized is that the role of the liberal intellectual establishment is to set very sharp bounds on how far you can go. This far and no further.
Give me some examples of that.
Well, let's take, say, the Vietnam War. Probably the leading critic, and in fact one of the leading dissident intellectuals in the mainstream, is Anthony Lewis of the New York Times, who did finally come around to opposing the Vietnam War about 1969. About a year and a half after corporate America had more or less ordered Washington to call it off. And his picture from then on is that the war, as he put it, began with blundering efforts to do good, but it ended up by 1969 being a disaster and costing us too much.
So what would the non-propaganda model have told Americans about the Vietnam War at the same time?
Same thing that the mainstream press was telling them about Afghanistan. The United States invaded, first of all, in the 1950s, it set up a standard Latin American-style terror state, which had massacred tens of thousands of people, but was unable to control a local uprising, and everyone knows, at least every specialist knows that's what it was. And when Kennedy came in 1961, they had to make a decision because the government was collapsing under local attack, so the U.S. just invaded the country. In 1961, the U.S. Air Force started bombing South Vietnamese civilians, authorized napalm, crop destruction. Then in 1965, February 1965, the next major escalation took place against South Vietnam, not against North Vietnam. That was a sideshow. That's what an honest press would be saying, but you can't find a trace of it.
Now, if the press is a censoring organization, tell me how that works. You're not suggesting that proprietors phone one another up, or that many journalists get their copy spiked, as we say?
It's actually, Orwell, you may recall, has an essay called Literary Censorship in England, which was supposed to be the introduction to Animal Farm, except that it never appeared, in which he points out, look, I'm writing about a totalitarian society, but in free democratic England, it's not all that different. And then he says unpopular ideas can be silenced without any force. And then he gives a two-sentence response, which is not very profound, but captures it. He says 2 reasons. First, the press is owned by wealthy men who have every interest in not having certain things appear. But second, the whole educational system, from the beginning on through, just gets you to understand that there are certain things you just don't say. Well, spelling these things out, that's perfectly correct. I mean, it's the first sentence is what we expand on.
This is what I don't get, because it suggests that, I mean, I'm a journalist, people like me are self-censoring.
No, not self-censoring. There's a filtering system that starts in kindergarten, goes all the way through, and it's not doesn't work 100%, but it's pretty effective. It selects for obedience and subordination. And especially, I think that's
so stroppy people won't make it to positions of influence.
Behavior problems, or if you read applications to a graduate school, you see that people will tell you he's not doesn't get along too well with his colleagues. You know how to interpret those things.
I'm just interested in this because I was brought up, like a lot of people, probably post the Watergate film and so on, to believe that journalism was a crusading craft and that there were a lot of disputatious, stroppy, difficult people in journalism. And I have to say, I think I know some of them.
Well, I know some of the best and best-known investigative reporters in the United States. I won't mention names because I don't want to, whose attitude toward the media is much more cynical than mine. In fact, they regard the media as a sham, and they know and they consciously talk about how they try to play it like a violin. If they see a little opening, they'll try to squeeze something in that ordinarily wouldn't make it through. And it's perfectly true that I'm sure you're speaking for the majority of journalists who are trained, have it driven into their heads that this is a crusading profession, adversarial, we stand up against power, a very self-serving view. On the other hand, in my opinion, I hate to make a value judgment, but the better journalists, and in fact the ones who are often regarded as the best journalists, have quite a different picture, and I think a very realistic one.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you know that journalists are self-censoring?
I'm sure you believe everything you're saying, but what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
We have a press which has, seems to me, a relatively wide range of view. There is a pretty small c conservative majority, but there are left-wing papers, there are liberal papers, and there is a pretty large offering of views running from the far right to the far left for those who want them. I don't see how a propaganda model can...
That's not quite true. I mean, there have been good studies of the British press, and you can look at them by James Curran as the major one, which points out that up until the 1960s, there was indeed a kind of a social democratic press which sort of represented much of the interests of working people and ordinary people and so on, and it was very successful. I mean, the Daily Herald, for example, had not only more, it had far higher circulation than other newspapers, but also a dedicated circulation. Furthermore, the tabloids at that time, the Mirror and the Sun, were kind of labor-based. By the 60s, that was all gone, and it disappeared under the pressure of capital resources. What was left was overwhelmingly the sort of center to right press with some dissidents. It's true.
I mean, we've got, I would say, a couple of large circulation newspapers which are left of centre, and which are putting in neo-Keynesian views which you'd call the elites are strongly hostile to.
It's interesting that you call neo-Keynesian left of centre. I'd just call it straight centre. I mean, left of center is a value term, doesn't mean anything.
Sure, you can.
But there are extremely good journalists in England. A number of them, they write very honestly and very good material. A lot of what they write couldn't appear here. On the other hand, if you look at the question overall, I don't think you're going to find a big difference. And there aren't many studies of the British press, but the few that there are have found pretty much the same results, and I think the better journalists will tell you that. In fact, what you have to do is check it out in cases. So let's take, say, what I just mentioned, the Vietnam War. The British press did not have the kind of stake in the Vietnam War that the American press did, because they weren't fighting. Just check sometime and find out how many times you can find the American war in Vietnam described as a U.S. attack against South Vietnam, beginning clearly with outright aggression in 1961 and escalating to massive aggression in 1965. If you can find 0.001% of the coverage saying that, you'll surprise me. And in a free press, 100% of it would have been saying that. Now, that's just a matter of fact. It has nothing to do with left and right.
Let me come up to a more modern war, which was the Gulf War, which again, you know, looking at the press in Britain and watching television, including some American television, I was very, very well aware of the anti-Gulf War dissidents, the No Blood for Oil campaigns.
And that's not the that's not the dissidents.
No blood for oil, isn't the
Saddam Hussein's attack on Kuwait took place on August 2nd. From August, within a few days, the great fear in Washington was that Saddam Hussein was going to withdraw and leave a puppet government, which would be pretty much what the U.S. had just done in Panama. The U.S. and Britain, therefore, moved very quickly to try to undercut the danger of withdrawal. By late August, negotiation offers were coming from Iraq, calling for a negotiated Iraqi withdrawal. The press wouldn't publish them here. It never published them in England. It did leak, however.
There was a great debate about whether there should have been a negotiated settlement.
No, there was not a debate. There was a debate about whether you should continue with sanctions, which is a different question. Because the fact of the matter is we have good evidence that by mid or late August, the sanctions had already worked. Because these stories were coming from high American officials in the State Department, former American officials like Richard Helm. They couldn't get the mainstream press to cover them, but they did manage to get one journal to cover them, Newsday. That's a suburban journal in Long Island. The purpose, obviously, being to smoke out the New York Times, because that's the only thing that matters. It came out in Newsday, and this continued. I won't go through the details, but this continued until January 2nd. At that time, the offers that were coming were apparently so meaningful to the State Department that State Department officials were saying that, look, this is negotiable, meaningful, maybe we don't accept everything, but it's certainly a basis for negotiated withdrawal. The press would not cover it. Newsday did. A few other people did. I have a couple of op-eds on it. And to my knowledge, you can check this, the first reference to any of this in England is actually in an article I wrote in The Guardian, which was in early January. You can check and see if there's an earlier reference.
Okay, let's look at one of the other key examples, which you've looked at too, which would appear to go against your idea, which is the Watergate.
Watergate is a perfect example. We've discussed it at length in our book, in fact, and elsewhere. It's a perfect example of the way the press was subordinated to power.
But this, this brought down a president.
Let me give you just a minute. Let's take a look. What happened there, here it's kind of interesting because you can't do experiments in history, but here history was kind enough to set one up for us. The Watergate exposures happened to take place at exactly the same time as another set of exposures, namely the exposures of COINTELPRO.
Oh, sorry, you have to explain that.
It's interesting that I have to explain it because it's vastly more significant than Watergate. That already makes my point. COINTELPRO was a program of subversion carried out not by a couple of petty crooks, but by the National Political Police, the FBI, under 4 administrations. It began in the late Eisenhower administration, ran up till...
This is aimed at the Socialist Workers' Party of America.
The Socialist Workers' Party was one tiny fragment of it. It began, by the time it got through, I won't run through the whole story, it was aimed at the entire New Left, at the women's movement, at the whole black movement. It was extremely broad. Its actions went as far as political assassination. Now, what's the difference between the two? Very clear. In Watergate, Richard Nixon went after half of U.S. private power, namely the Democratic Party, and power can defend itself. So therefore, that's a scandal. He didn't do anything. Nothing happened. Look, I was on Nixon's enemies list. I didn't even know. Nothing ever happened.
But nonetheless, you wouldn't say it was an insignificant event.
No, it was a case where half of U.S. power defended itself against a person who had obviously stepped out of line. And the fact that the press thought that was important shows that they think powerful people ought to be able to defend themselves. Now, whether there was a question of principle involved happens to be easily checked in this case. One tiny part of the COINTELPRO program was itself far more significant in terms of principle than all of Watergate. And if you look at the whole program, I mean, it's not even a discussion. But you have to ask me what COINTELPRO is. You know what Watergate is. There couldn't be a more dramatic example of the subordination of the educated opinion to power here in England as well as in the United States.
I know you've concentrated on foreign affairs and some of these key areas.
Things we've been talking a lot about domestic policy.
But, well, I'd like to come on to that because it still seems to me that on a range of pretty important issues for the establishment, there is serious dissent. Gingrich and his neo-conservative agenda in America has been pretty savagely lampooned. The apparently fixed succession for the Republican candidacy at the presidential election has come apart. Clinton, who is a powerful figure, is having great difficulty with Whitewater. Everywhere one looks, one sees disjunctures, openings.
Within a spectrum so narrow that you really have to look hard to find it.
Well, can I just stop you there? Because you say the spectrum is narrow, but on the one hand,
let me illustrate.
We've got flat tax Republicans right the way through to relatively big state Democrats.
Find one. Find a big state Democrat. The position now is exactly what Clinton said. The era of big government is over. Big government has failed. The war on poverty has failed. We have to get rid of this entitlement business. That was Clinton's campaign message in 1992. That's the Democrats. What you have now is a difference between sort of moderate Republicans and extreme Republicans. Actually, it's well known that there's been a long-standing sort of split in the American business community. It's not precise, but it's sort of general, between high-tech, capital-intensive, internationally oriented business, which tends to be what's called liberal, and lower-tech, more nationally oriented, more labor-intensive industry, which is what's called conservative. Now, between those sectors, there have been differences. And in fact, if you take a look at American politics, it oscillates pretty much between those limits. There's good work on this. Incidentally, the person who's done the most extensive work is Thomas Ferguson, who's a political scientist.
One more example, which will have some resonance in Britain and Europe, is the great argument over the North American Free Trade Association, the NAFTA argument, where if there is something which one could describe as a global opposition movement, that is trade union, environmental, community-based, then it was certainly present in the anti-NAFTA.
Shall I tell you what happened? Shall I tell you what happened?
All I was going to say is that those arguments were well, we were well aware of those arguments.
That is flatly false. They were not permitted into the press, and I've documented this. I'll give you references if you like.
We read all about it in Britain, is all I would say.
I did not. For example, let me ask you, did you read the report of the Office of Technology Association of Congress? Did you read the report of the Labor Advisory Committee?
Well, I don't get these reports, but I read many articles about the anti-NAFTA argument.
I'll tell you what.
Some very vivid stuff.
Well, if you're interested in the facts, I'll tell you what they are, and I'll even give you sources. The NAFTA agreement was signed more or less in secret by the three presidents in mid-August at the time of the Congress, right in the middle of the presidential campaign in mid-August. Now, there's a law in the United States, 1974 Trade Act, which requires that any trade-related issue be submitted to the Labor Advisory Committee, which is union-based, for assessment and analysis. It was never submitted to them. A day before they were supposed to give their final report in mid-September, it was finally submitted to them. They were infuriated. The unions are pretty right-wing, but they were infuriated. They had never been shown this. They had even at the time that they had to write the report, they were given 24 hours to write the report. They didn't have time to look at the text. Nevertheless, they wrote a very vigorous analysis of it with alternatives presented, saying, look, we're not against NAFTA, we're against this version of it. They gave a good analysis. Happened to be very similar to one that had been given by the Congressional Research Service, the Office of Technology Assessment. None of this ever entered the press. The only thing that entered the press was the kind of critique that they were willing to deal with. Mexico bashing, right-wing nationalists, and so on. That entered the press, but not the critical analysis of the labor movement.
Well, now, somehow by process of osmosis or something, I picked up quite a lot of anti-NAFTA arguments on the basis of worker protection, environmental degradation.
May I continue? This goes on in the press right until the end. By the end, there were big popular movements opposing it. It was extremely hard to suppress all of this, to suppress everything coming out of the labor movement, out of the popular movements, and so on, but they did. At the very end, it had reached such a point that there was concern that they might not be able to ram this through. Now, take a look at the New York Times and the Washington Post, say the liberal media, and the national ones in the last couple of weeks. And I'll tell you, I've written about it and tell you what you find. What you find is 100% support for NAFTA, refusal to allow any of the popular arguments out, tremendous labor bashing.
Can I come back to make sure that I understand the point about the liberal press as against the conservative press? Because in Britain, over the last 2 years, politicians I come across are deeply irritated, ranging on furious about attacks on them in the press, day after day, on issues which have come to be known as sleaze. They feel that they are harassed, that they are misunderstood, and that the press has got above itself, is uppity, and is destructive. That's the message that they are giving God. Now, are you saying that that whole process doesn't matter, as it were, because it's all part of the same?
I mean, when the press, the same thing is true here. When the press focuses on the sex lives of politicians, reach for your pocket and see who's pulling out your wallet. I mean, because those are not the issues that matter to people. I mean, they're very marginal interests. The issues that matter to people are somewhere else. So as soon as you hear, you know, the press and presidential candidates and so on talking about values, as I say, put your hand on your wallet. And you know that something else is happening.
But it's been much more than, certainly with us, it's been much more than bed hopping. It's also been about taking money.
Corruption,
it's been about the corporations paying for
corruption,
for
corrupt judges, fine topic.
Corrupt parties.
Corrupt parties. Big business is not in favor of corruption, you know. And if the press focuses on corruption, Fortune magazine will be quite happy. They don't care about that. They don't want the society to be corrupt. They want it to be run in their interest. That's a different thing. Corruption interferes with that. So, for example, when I was, let's say, I just happened to come back from India, the Bank of India released an estimate, economists, they're telling me it's low, that a third of the economy is black, meaning mostly rich businessmen not paying their taxes. Well, that makes the press, because in fact, certainly transnationals don't like it. They want the system to be run without corruption, robbery, bribes, and so on, just pouring money into their pockets. So yes, that's a fine topic for the press. On the other hand, the topics I've talked about are not fine topics because they're much too significant.
What would a press be like, do you think, without the propaganda model? What would we be reading in the papers that we don't read about now?
I've just given a dozen examples. On every example that, incidentally, you've picked, I haven't picked. I mean, I could pick my own. I'm happy to let you pick them. On every one of those examples, I think you can demonstrate that there's been a severe distortion of what the facts of the matter are. This has nothing to do with left and right, as I've been stressing, and it has left the population pretty confused and marginalized. A free press would just tell you the truth. This has nothing to do with left and right.
And given the power of big business, the power of the press, what can people do about this?
They can do exactly what people do in the Haitian slums and hills, organize. In Haiti, which is the most, take that, the poorest country in the hemisphere, they created a very vibrant, lively civil society in the slums, in the hills, in conditions that most of us can't even imagine. We can do the same much more easily.
You've got community activists in America. Yes, you've got, I'm not talking about the so-called communitarian movement, but I'm talking about the local community activists and writers all over the place.
All over the place. Take, say, a city like Boston.
And the way
all sorts of people, they don't even know of each other's existence. There's a very large number of them. One of the things I do constantly is run around the country giving talks. One of my main purposes, and the purposes of the people who invite me, is to bring together people in that area who are working on the same things and don't know of each other's existence, because the resources are so scattered and the means of communication are so marginal, there isn't just much they can do about it. Now, there are plenty of things that are happening. So take, say, community-based radio, which is sort of outside the system.
I was going to ask you about that and about the internet, which has certainly got pretty open access at the moment.
Well, the internet is like most technology, is a very double-edged sword. It has, like any technology, including printing, it has a liberatory potential, but it also has a repressive potential. And there's a battle going on about which way it's going to go, as there was for radio and television and so on.
About ownership and advertising.
Right, and about just what's going to be in it and who's going to have access to it. Remember, incidentally, that the internet is an elite operation. Most of the population of the world has never even made a phone call, so that's certainly not on the internet. Nevertheless, it does have democratizing potential. And there's a struggle going on right now as to whether that's going to be realized or whether it will turn into something like a home marketing service and a way of marginalizing people even further. That discussion went on in the 1920s over radio, and it's interesting how it turned out. It went on over television, it's now going on over the internet. And that's a matter of popular struggle. Look, we don't live the way we did 200 years ago or even 30 years ago. There's been a lot of progress. It hasn't been gifts from above. It's been the result of people getting together and refusing to accept the dictates of authoritarian institutions. And there's no reason to think that that's over.
You've been portrayed, and some would say occasionally portrayed yourself as a kind of lonely, dissident voice. You clearly don't feel lonely at all.
I say nothing like that. I certainly do not portray myself that way. I can't begin to accept a fraction of the invitations from around the country. I'm scheduled 2 years in advance. And at that, I'm only selecting a fraction of them.
And you're speaking to big
huge
audiences.
Huge audiences. And these are not elite intellectuals either. These are mostly popular audiences. I probably spend 20 or 30 hours a week just answering letters from people all over the country and the world. I wish I felt a little more lonely. I don't. Of course, I'm not on NPR. You know, I wouldn't be in the mainstream media, but I wouldn't expect that. Why should they offer space to somebody who's trying to undermine their power and to expose what they do? But that's not loneliness.
Professor Chomsky, thank you very much.